In the crisp autumn of 1965, as the sun dipped over the savannas of southern Rhodesia, Prime Minister Ian Douglas Smith and his cabinet gathered in Salisbury. On November 11th, they signed the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI, a document modeled deliberately on the American Declaration of 1776. For the white Rhodesians, descendants of pioneers, farmers, and World War II veterans who had flown with the RAF, it was an act of defiant loyalty to a British heritage they felt London was abandoning. Rhodesia, self-governing since 1923, with one of Africa's most advanced economies, a thriving tobacco industry, and a professional security force, believed it had earned full sovereignty. Britain, however, saw it as a rebellion. The roots of this rupture stretched back to the winds of change sweeping Africa. Harold Macmillan's 1960 speech in Cape Town had signaled Britain's accelerating decolonization. By the mid-1960s, most British colonies in Africa had gained independence, often with chaotic results: the Congo's descent into civil war, mass expulsions in Kenya, and the emergence of one-party states. Rhodesia's white population, around 220,000 against 4 million blacks, had built a modern state: roads, mines, farms producing food for the region, universities, and a military that punched above its weight. They pointed to the gradual enfranchisement under the 1961 Constitution, which tied voting rights to educational and property qualifications, arguing that it prevented the rapid majority rule that had destabilized neighboring states. Prime Minister Harold Wilson's Labour government, elected in 1964, faced a different calculus. Britain was economically strained, militarily overstretched after Suez, and desperate to maintain influence in the Commonwealth and at the United Nations amid the Cold War. African and Asian nations, backed by the Soviet bloc and China, demanded NIBMA, no independence before majority African rule. Wilson's position hardened: any settlement must be acceptable to the people as a whole, a formula interpreted as requiring rapid transition to black majority rule. Smith countered that this ignored tribal divisions, lack of broad education, and the risk of Marxist guerrillas. Negotiations collapsed dramatically. Wilson flew to Salisbury in late October 1965 for tense talks. Smith offered compromises. Wilson demanded more. Back in London, Wilson warned Parliament of sanctions. On UDI Day, Britain immediately declared the act illegal, expelled Rhodesia from the Sterling area, froze assets, banned arms and investment, and suspended Commonwealth preferences. Tobacco, Rhodesia's golden crop, faced an embargo. The UN followed with voluntary sanctions, later mandatory under Resolution 232 in 1966, the first such action in UN history. Yet enforcement was selective. Portugal's Mozambique and apartheid South Africa kept borders porous. Oil flowed through Lourenço Marques. South African railways carried goods. Rhodesian ingenuity kicked in. Sanctions busting became a national sport. Companies rerouted shipments, forged documents, and developed local industries. The economy contracted but adapted, with import substitution and diversified agriculture. White Rhodesians rallied, singing "Rhodesians never die" as their farms became fortresses. The guerrilla war simmered, then erupted. ZANU and ZAPU, backed by China and the USSR, respectively, launched incursions. Early attacks were crushed by the Rhodesian Light Infantry, Sealer Scouts, and Rhodesian African Rifles, a multiracial force where black soldiers often formed the majority in combat roles. In December 1972, the war intensified with Zanla attacks on Altina and Whistlefield farms in the northeast. Farmers were murdered, villagers intimidated. Rhodesian Fire Force tactics, helicopter-borne paratroopers and Alouette gunships, delivered a devastating response, achieving kill ratios that stunned observers. But the conflict ground on, blending high-intensity bush patrols with intelligence operations that penetrated guerrilla networks. Britain's stance appeared principled, opposing racial minority rule, but deeper geopolitical self-interest drove it. Wilson's government feared Commonwealth collapse. Zambia and Tanzania threatened to quit. African states lobbied furiously at the UN. Britain, still a global player with bases and trade interests across Africa, could not afford to be seen propping up white settlers. Economic ties with Black Africa, potential mineral access, and Cold War positioning against Soviet influence in the region outweighed loyalty to kith and kin in Salisbury. Invading Rhodesia was contemplated. Detailed plans involved RAF strikes, Royal Marines, and SAS seizures of airfields, but dismissed as politically suicidal and logistically nightmarish against a determined, battle-hardened population. Talks aboard HMS Tiger in 1966 and HMS Fearless in 1968 failed spectacularly. Smith and Wilson clashed over timelines for majority rule and safeguards for whites. Smith returned home a hero. Wilson faced domestic criticism from conservatives who sympathized with Rhodesia. Sanctions bit harder over time, especially after Portugal's 1974 Carnation Revolution turned Mozambique Marxist, closing the eastern border and intensifying guerrilla sanctuaries. South African Prime Minister John Vorster, under his own pressures, urged a settlement. By the mid-1970s, Rhodesia was isolated but unbowed militarily. The Bush War claimed thousands of lives: civilians, security forces, and insurgents. Cross-border raids into Mozambique and Zambia, like Operation Eland or the destruction of guerrilla camps, showcased Rhodesian audacity. Yet the demographic reality, whites outnumbered 20-1, and endless international condemnation drained resources. Britain watched, applying pressure through diplomacy while avoiding direct responsibility for its rebellious colony. The endgame accelerated in the late 1970s. Ian Smith, facing unsustainable attrition, reached an internal settlement with moderate black leader Bishop Abel Muzorewa in 1979, creating Zimbabwe Rhodesia. It expanded black participation but retained security force control. Western powers, including the incoming Thatcher government and the US under Carter, deemed it insufficient. Sanctions persisted. The war raged. Zipra and Zanla escalated attacks, mining roads, ambushing convoys, and targeting farms in a campaign of terror that killed over 30,000 by some estimates. Rhodesian forces struck back with spectacular raids, but the economy buckled under manpower shortages. Every able-bodied white man rotated through call-ups. Margaret Thatcher, elected in 1979, inherited the crisis. Initially inclined toward the internal settlement, she was persuaded by Foreign Secretary Lord Carrington of a bolder path, the Lancaster House Conference. From September to December 1979, in London's Grand Lancaster House, Smith, Muzorewa, and the Patriotic Front leaders Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo hammered out terms under British chairmanship. It was tense, theatrical diplomacy, walkouts, threats, all-night sessions. Britain promised to resume sovereignty temporarily, oversee elections with a Commonwealth monitoring force, and lift sanctions. Crucially, a new constitution included a 20% white reserve seats block for 10 years and protections for property. Rhodesians returned home wary. Many white farmers and soldiers felt betrayed. Lancaster House seemed another British maneuver to exit cleanly. Yet war weariness prevailed. Elections in March 1980, supervised by British Governor Lord Soames and Commonwealth observers, delivered a landslide for Mugabe's ZANU-PF allegations of intimidation in rural areas abounded, but Britain certified the result. On April 18, 1980, the Union Jack lowered for the last time. Zimbabwe was born. Rhodesia was sacrificed. Britain's policy was called geopolitical arithmetic. Retaining the moral high ground in the Commonwealth and UN preserved diplomatic capital amid declining empire. Confronting the Afro-Asian bloc risked isolation at a time when Britain sought EEC entry and managed Soviet threats elsewhere. Economic self-interest played a role. Broader African markets and avoidance of costly military entanglement outweighed Rhodesian tobacco or chrome. Wilson and successors framed it as anti-racism, but documents and contemporary accounts reveal pragmatic calculation, avoiding precedent for other settler issues and navigating domestic politics where Rhodesia divided opinion. South Africa's survival was tolerated longer due to its strategic minerals and Cape Route importance. Rhodesia, smaller and more vulnerable, was expendable. The human cost was immense. Rhodesian security forces, among the finest counterinsurgency units ever fielded, had not lost militarily. They adapted helicopters, tracker teams, and pseudo-operations with legendary skill. Yet political defeat was inevitable once neighbors turned hostile and the West withheld recognition. White exodus followed independence. Mugabe's rhetoric turned vengeful. The economy faltered. By the 2000s, farm invasions devastated agriculture. Hyperinflation ravaged the nation, and millions fled. What was once Africa's breadbasket became a cautionary tale of mismanagement. Rhodesia's story pulses with action. Daring fire force drops under dawn skies, sealer scouts infiltrating enemy lines, farmers defending homesteads with FN rifles, and pilots in aging Canberras striking deep into enemy territory. It blends poignant details, Sunday barbecues turning to funerals, schools doubling as strongpoints, and a society that achieved high literacy and health standards for all races amid siege. Britain's role, often portrayed as a reluctant referee, was one of calculated withdrawal. UDI forced London's hand, but successive governments prioritised global image, Commonwealth cohesion, and avoidance of quagmire over sustaining a loyal, functional outpost. In hindsight, the sacrifice bought Britain short-term prestige but contributed to long-term skepticism about Western commitments. Rhodesians fought not just for minority privilege but a vision of merit-based, stable governance they believed served all. Their defeat underscored a harsh truth of decolonisation. Geopolitical interests, not ideals alone, dictated outcomes. The fertile highlands, once green with maize and tobacco under disciplined management, tell a silent story of what was lost when the empire's cold calculus prevailed.